Hi guys, welcome back. So here I'm just looking at the latest version of the propagation hexagons I have. And so a few tweaks since the last video is I just increased the amount of displacement a little bit. So it was a bit more obvious, and some tweaks to the contrast of the mask. So I like this, and I think it's time to move on to the shading aspect of the main drone underneath, and then we'll also need to work on a shader for the hexagons, but I'll save that for the next video. For now, what I want is basically these hexagons will be revealing the shaded drone underneath here, but I want to see if we can add some extra detail to this drone. So at the moment it's just a basic dark reflective shader here, but if we can add some emissive elements, so maybe some highlights on the edges, on the internal areas, then we can use that in comp and include that as part of the mask. So even though the hexagons maybe run out over here, you get these glowing highlights in the middle that can also kind of wipe out and use the same mask. So it's just an extra layer of detail to hopefully help blend in between what's happening here and what's happening underneath. So let me start by just put down a mantra, and I'll set some basic settings in here. Not final settings, but just to make it quicker for us to test the shading. So let's go half resolution. Let's keep motion blur off. Pixel samples 3. I'll switch off ray variance for now. Stochastic. Let's switch off refractions and just reduce the reflection limit there. And then, not to forget, we need to exclude the OpenGL light. That should be us. I'm going to also put the environment in as a matte. The reason being that I can't just render the drone by itself without the environment because it's reflective. So then I'll have the entire sky reflecting from above and from below, and it wouldn't be an accurate representation of the shading. So I need this environment to occlude those reflections. So I'll keep it in there as a matte, and then what else do we need? That should be us, and we're rendering this. Let me just apply the shader. So I made a basic shader for the drone cache here, and I've just copied that into a shopnet down over here. And the only difference here is I've written out our geometry with the color attribute transferred from the propagation. So that should be us. Let's do a quick test render. Okay, so that's what we have. So it's quite a dark metallic object at the moment, and I just want to try and bring out some details, some emissive details inside. So there's some tools we can use in the shading context, like curvature. So we could use curvature to get convex and concave detail, and occlusion, and then obviously noises. So if I jump into this shader now, it's just a principal core compute lighting, and we're outputting the color there. So let's start with, actually I'm going to start with outputting an extra image plane for our color, because the color we have on this object is the most important mask in comp. going to export as a vector 4 just so we can include or exclude alpha from that extra image plane. So let's go vector 4 here. We'll do vector to vector 4 on the color, and I'll just leave the alpha at 0. So that mask shouldn't have any alpha. So I'll come back to my mantra, images, extra image planes, and we'll come and add mask, vector 4. So there we have our very important mask as a separate AOV. So that works fine, and while I'm here I'm just going to include direct and indirect lighting and combined emission and normal. So normal could be particularly important once we're comping this, because that'll give me access to our kind of Fresnel. And because we're adding a reflective pass, we'll probably need to be recreating the look of this asset in comp. So we need the indirect and direct reflection, and we can combine that back together in comp. So that's our render layers there. Let's go back into the shader. And now for starters, I always like to start with a noise. Because we might not even see the noise at the end, but we'll be multiplying things together, and we want to at least make sure the noise looks good if it's covering the whole drone. So we'll start with that, and then we'll use it to multiply and add. So at the moment I'm just disconnecting the shader and plugging the noise straight into the color, because that's all we need to see at the moment. Right, and then for the position I'm going to use rest. We do have rest on our object. And if I'm not mistaken, in that rest position, the drone is oriented on the Z axis, so we can use that. So by using rest, we make sure that the noise is stuck to the object and not swimming. And I'm just going to choose my favorite noise settings here. Some Wall-E, standard fractal. I'll add some warping. So I don't have anything particular that I'm looking for, but I just want an interesting looking noise, because the idea here is if we start adding bright lines with emission, if we pass a noise through that, then we can vary the intensity. So it's just adding another layer of extra. You don't want just a perfectly bright line. We want this line to sort of become bright and go dim over time. So I'll put in a noise that looks decent. That's pretty cool. And then let's put in a transform. Nope, not transform. Transform matrix. And promote our translate. And then, as we know, if the drone is oriented in Z, should double check that. So if I come all the way back up here, I have our drone asset and I have move to rest. So here we can check what the rest position looks like, and you can see our drone is facing in positive Z. So if I move the drone's rest position in the shader in negative Z, then the noise should feel like it's moving in this direction. And that's what I want. because, let's just go back here, because our mask and our hexagons are revealing the drone basically from the back here to the front. And so any extra emissive stuff inside, if that's pulsating, we need it to be moving in the same direction as that mask. It could move maybe just up or backwards, but I feel like everything should be moving in this direction from left to right. So we have our transform, and that's been promoted up here. So let's say $f times 0.2 times -1. So we're moving the rest position in -z. And now if I test a few frames just to check our speed and our direction. Our direction looks good, but it's way too fast. So I'm just going to test a few more frames again. Yep, that seems about right. So we just have this noise moving through the drone from its tail to its face. And now if we need to, we can multiply several layers by this noise here. So what else were we going to try? Curvature. And I'm not sure about the settings on this shader, but it should be split into convex and concave. So those obtuse angles and the acute angles. So I think, let's just plug this in. I'm going to use rest again as our position, and we need a normal. And let's put this straight through to the color again. Seems to be taking a little while. Just going to take this opportunity to hit re-render. Bear in mind, every now and again, especially with shading, you do have to hit render to make sure you're loading everything again. I wonder if this curvature is taking particularly long for any specific reason. I'll start putting down some more nodes. Here we go. So that's done the job. That's pretty much just adjusting the colors in here just to see what we have. And it's a little bit messy, but it's definitely giving us our curvature, which I thought the most important one for us would be concave. We want to be able to highlight points in this mesh that are actually feel slightly more internal. So any angles that are basically going like that. But let's see what happens if I Yeah, so that's just sharpening that up a little bit. Let's put in these ramps because I have an idea to have two ramps, one of them as a sort of, let's call this edge for now, and one of them as our inner, because what we can do is we can invert this just using the color ramps. So let's just plug this one in here. So here we can clamp, oh, it's not doing anything. Oh, wrong one. Yeah, so there we can tighten up our edge value. So we're just keeping the bright bits. It looks pretty thick. I think if we look at the hexagon pattern here, it's a bit wide, so it's looking circular. I don't know if there's a way to sharpen up this convex, or if that even is the convex. It's kind of hard to tell. There's quite a lot of detail in this mesh. Looks pretty cool though. Yeah, we just drop this down. I'll leave it at that for now, and then we'll try the other ramp. And with this one, we can just invert the direction of this ramp. So we have ramp edge, which is white on this side, and we have ramp inner, which is the opposite. So there we're getting much more what I would expect from the concave value. So that's pretty cool as well. I can imagine this glowing. So these internal edges here and here, just after the hexagons pass over, these can still be glowing a kind of hot blue color. So I think that works nicely. And what else can we do? So I'm basically just putting down some nodes now and not worrying yet about what's being multiplied and what we're adding. Let's try that occlusion. And we need position and normal. Okay. Put down our ramp. So if we invert this as well, we want the occluded areas to actually be brighter. Oh, that looks cool. That's very cool. So we're highlighting all of the areas that technically should be dark because of occlusion, but we're going to try use it to make it feel like the drone's kind of hotter on the inside. So we can use this to mask out one of our layers here. So let's just check the settings. So we have a ray distance and samples. So there's not much to do here. I mean, I can reduce, the distance of what it considers occluded. So I just want something large. And I'm just going really tight with the shrimp because I really only want to keep what's inside. Let me just try something like this. Yeah, it looks really cool. Okay, so we've got a few things to play with here now in the shader. And all of this stuff will be just emission, so we don't want to really affect the reflectivity or anything like that. So we've got some pretty cool edges. We've got our color mask. So I want to multiply some stuff together. Let's start by going back to these edges here, because they are the strongest at the moment, the strongest and the cleanest, but not really internal feeling. So I'm going to multiply that by our noise. So as I said, moving into the shader, nothing specific in planning this. It's more how cool can we make this drone look just by using the shader and not adding anything that's definitely an effect as such. So it's a good idea to jump in, and if you're not familiar with shading that much, you should definitely spend some time just messing around in a shading network until it becomes as easy as moving around in, say, SOPs, because there is a lot of very interesting stuff you can do just by plugging in different shader context tools and multiplying stuff together, and you can come up with really complex looking stuff. So it's also a really good place to experiment. So here I'm multiplying our edges by that noise. I'm going to put in a power so I can add some more contrast to this. Okay, that looks pretty cool. So now I might need, oh, crash. Okay, so I had a strange crash and I'm not sure why. I've just loaded up the temp file that was saved and saved it as a new version here. So straight back to where we were when Houdini decided to die. What I think I was about to say was these lines look pretty thick. So I like what the noise is doing to this particular layer, but these still look pretty thick to me. So let me just see if there's any room to adjust that in comp, or if I need to do something in the shader. Maybe just adjust this ramp a bit. Doesn't seem to be doing much. So ramp edge, curvature. Don't really want to change any of that. Let's leave it for now. So that's our edge multiplied by the noise. And if we come back down to our inner, this was the inverted version of that. And that's cool as well. So let's see. Instead of multiplying this one by the noise, we will multiply it by the occlusion. Now I might want the occlusion, actually, I really like the way the occlusion was looking, so it could be useful as a whole separate layer by itself. By multiplying this layer by the occlusion, I'm forcing all that interesting internal line detail to be really central to the drone. make sure it's only the occluded areas that are lighting up. That works quite nicely actually. I'm going to add these together. It's looking pretty cool. And you can just go around and tweak these ramps. Just hoping Houdini doesn't crash again while I'm doing this. It's funny, this ramp, I think I need to hit re-render. So it is being multiplied by our noise. So I could also increase the amplitude here to make that layer brighter. So I quite like that. So we have a few things going on here. Let's plug this back into our actual shader. Don't crash. Back into our shader and add some color to this. So there's just our reflective drone. I'll plug in the result here into emission color and put down a final ramp here right at the end. Ramp color. So a lot of ramps in this shader here. So here let's make this go faster. So that's our drone shader with the emission, which is just white. So let's choose a nice blue. So this is working very nicely. So we have a nice blue emissive element here, and we can rebuild our drone without the emission in comp, and then we can have our emission here as a separate AOV and use this as part of our hexagon mask to make the drone underneath look more interesting as well. So that looks a lot more interesting than just the flat, dark, reflective drone underneath. And we are getting some extra bounce here for free. Well, not for free, but as part of the shader by default. This emission illuminates objects. So whether or not we want that depends, I guess, on what kind of render time we're looking for and whether or not it just looks better. So I am liking the effect because here we're getting some reflection and stuff built in. If I switch it off, it looks a bit less interesting, but it does give us a cleaner emission that we could use. I mean, we can still generate a geolight or something to affect the actual drone, and this would give us a very clean emission pass. Whereas here now we get the actual light as part of that. So we either have to deal with that or just go for the clean option and generate our lines, our lights by ourselves. So I think they both kind of work. I'm going to leave it on for now because I really like that sense of dynamic light. So let's leave this shader here. I'll end this video, and when we come back, I might just recap over that shader quickly before we move on to shading the hexagons. So I'll see you guys then.